Hey everyone. So my name's Jeremy. I'm the lead designer and lead programmer at Studio Wildcard and of course on ARK Survival Evolved. And I'm going to be talking to you today about user-generated content and Steam Workshop in ARK and how we did it, some of the challenges about doing it, and why you should do it too. So first, let me just give you a little bit of context. When we launched ARK, we didn't actually plan on having user-generated content in day one, but shortly after its release, it was pretty clear that we were not going to be able to keep up with people's expectations for content in the game. Players were churning through everything we had really fast, and they wanted more, and they wanted it faster. And we said, you know, could we really do this UGC thing? I had done it before on Dungeon Defenders, a previous game, and I said, we can probably pull it off technically, and it might actually solve some of our challenges with keeping people engaged on a daily basis without us having to make new content on a daily basis. So we did have to, however, carefully concern certain pros and cons about doing it, which I'm going to run through right now, some of the upsides and the downsides of UGC. So the first upside, effectively, is better engagement. Essentially, you turn your players into evangelical creators. Instead of it just being a one-way street where you make something and they consume it, it actually becomes kind of a two-way street where they make stuff that other players consume as well. And that ultimately creates a much more, I think, collaborative community and a community that is more positive, in my opinion. It's actually constructive and creative and indeed artistic. And I think it really unleashes the power of your community to help spread the word about your game more than just if they are consumers. Second point is kind of what I alluded to in the first slide, which was feeding the beast, essentially reducing some of the pressure on you as the developer to create that new content on a daily basis. Ultimately, I think everybody who's made games, especially games which are updated over time, has felt kind of a pressure to keep pushing more content into it, to give players new things to do, and UGC, frankly, takes a lot of that pressure away. Third good point is, well, you might get very lucky and get a unicorn piece of user-generated content. Essentially, a UGC content that actually changes how people view the game and provides tremendous additional value. This is certainly not a guaranteed thing. In fact, it may even be unlikely, but it is possible if you support enough capability for players to change enough powerful things about the game. There's obviously plenty of examples beyond just these three of mods over the history of PC gaming that have changed the nature of the game on which they were based, but some recent notable examples are Battle Royale in Arma 3, Defense of the Ancients in Warcraft 3, and Counter-Strike in Half-Life. I think even Team Fortress, if I recall, was a Quake mod back in the day. So this obviously goes way back in the history of mods with PC gaming, but UGC opens up the possibility of such an amazing piece of content changing how players view your game. Customization. Ultimately, everybody's looking for a slightly different experience. Everybody wants probably something a little different out of your game. And if you support UGC, there's a lot more possibilities for creators and players to customize the game to be what they want it to be. Now, even without UGC, of course, you can provide enough options in the game for them to turn this or that feature on and off, but a good UGC implementation will let them get into the guts of the game and really change things. And so in ARK's case, for example, we have sci-fi and modern technology elements, and some players really don't want that. They just want more of a focus on primitive survival. That wasn't the game that we were going to be creating for them, but UGC has enabled them to essentially create that game on top of ARK for themselves. Another good point is UGC is effectively, in some ways, an experimentation chamber for ideas that maybe shouldn't be in the game yet, maybe ever, but it's less risky for players and sometimes the developers to iterate on these ideas in UGC because they're very optional, they're very kind of tentative. If you were to delete a UGC, it's not like deleting a DLC or some aspect of the core game. So it can be used both by players and developers, but more specifically players, as essentially a testing area for new ideas. And sometimes these ideas actually work out really well and then can be incorporated back into the main game. And we have some examples of that, which I'll go over a little bit later. Sometimes players can even solve stuff, bugs or balance issues that the developers have left in the game. We have a lot of balance mods for ARK that players seem to think are more fun than the base game. So sometimes we incorporate those changes back into the game. And even if we don't, it at least gives players a different kind of way to play. And so sometimes your game can become better by players fixing problems that might already exist in it. Another good reason is to extend the title lifecycle. Ultimately, every game, every product is going to have kind of a natural life cycle. And at some point, the developer is probably going to want to move on and create a new game. And even if they don't, they'll probably create less content over time. But by having UGC and a strong implementation, that life cycle gets extended dramatically. I'm sure someone could graph it out, but I think any game that has UGC is going to have a much longer tail of both player base, active players, and ultimately sales that will last a lot longer because of the new content the players will create over time. And you will find, of course, numerous examples of games that have come out years ago, have had no significant updates from the developers, and years later, players are still creating new content for them. And that ultimately retains player interest over that time. Final good reason is it's just fun. Ultimately, we create games because we like the process of making them, we like the process of seeing people play them. And another layer to that is actually seeing what people can make with the systems that you have built for them. And it's extremely rewarding to wake up every day and see new items, new ideas, new creative pieces of art within the game, things that we couldn't have thought of ourselves, but the vast player base themselves can come up with. And it both strengthens us and motivates us as a developer, and it also creates, I think, a stronger bond between us and our players, because frankly, they have more ownership of the game because they've seen how it works. There are some drawbacks. It's not all roses. And it's important, if you're going to do UGC, you at least consider these. They're not all applicable to all games, and they depend, I think, on the depth of user-generated content support you add, but they're worth mentioning. There are going to be, depending on what game engine you're using, probably some technical challenges to implementing a good UGC system and how much power you want to give to the player. It's also worth mentioning that ultimately, once you release support for UGC, you're going to have to factor that into all future updates to not break content that players have already created and released, to not take away features that they're reliant on. And that can complicate your QA pipeline, because obviously there's no conceivable way to test every piece of content that players have ever released. So you have to kind of be very aware of how they're using your systems so that you don't actually accidentally break them in a future update. It's not really a good idea to deliberately break them and rely on people to re-update all their content. You'll find that many players will, even content creators, will not get around to doing that. Another downside is that ultimately it's going to dilute the content base a little bit, and there won't be so much of a focus on your official content. I don't really consider that a negative, but it is worth noting that you won't be the only player in town, so to speak, releasing new content for the game. And if that is a concern, you should weigh that against the depth of the UGC implementation. For an online game especially, it is a concern to potentially fracture your player base. Depending on the size of your user base, you may want all players playing in the same mode or in the same map. If you support UGC, you'll probably have a lot of modes and a lot of maps. And ultimately, those players are going to spread out among more possibilities. And if you don't have a large enough player base, that could potentially dilute the ability to find enough players to play an online game. It's just worth keeping in mind. And again, it depends on whether you support, say, new maps and modes. There is, of course, the necessity when releasing UGC of opening up the curtain a little bit and exposing how things work to your players. That can be a little embarrassing. They might see tricks, hacks, cheats that you use, depending on the level of code or script access they may have. They'll certainly see all of your magic numbers. And depending on how you pack the content and distribute it to them, they may even see content that you never meant to release or that you haven't released yet. Again, transparency is usually a good policy, and players are probably finding out stuff anyway through various technical, decompiling methods. So it's not really a big concern, but it's worth noting you might be stepping into that, as we did on both ARK and Dungeon Defenders. There is, of course, the challenge of support with UGC. Ultimately, UGC can have its own bugs, some of which are due to things we have done wrong, but most of the time are due to players adding bugs, the content creators accidentally adding bugs themselves. Now, from an end user standpoint, the end user is not necessarily aware, okay, I'm playing on a custom piece of content, so I should contact that author if I find a bug. They're probably just going to assume it's a bug in our game and our stuff, and they're going to contact us. And so it adds a little bit of overhead to customer support and analyzing issues to, say, ask them, okay, what UGC items are you running with? Okay, maybe it's due to that. Let's try and reproduce it with that and then get back with the original author. Your customer support pipeline could be somewhat complicated as a result of that. Depending on how you pack your content together for UGC, you may need to ship with more content than you normally would have in the game or less efficient content, because UGC will most likely rely on loading individual assets. In ARK's case, for example, the optimized content that we originally shipped the game with is packed together in seek-free loading files, so they load sequentially off disk to reduce hard drive seeks. But in order to support robust modding, we also had to include the content as separated files so that mods could load things in an arbitrary order. That almost doubled the size of the game. It was a worthy trade-off in our case to support robust modding. But it's something that, depending on your game engine, you should be aware may be a download concern. Finally, there's always the potential for inappropriate content. This is maybe not an issue for many or most games, but if your game is strongly oriented towards children, or if you want to have a very tight control or rein on the presentation of things in-game on YouTube and such, then be aware that when you give robust UGC tools, people will probably put the most inappropriate things they can find in them, both and also potential copyright infringement issues with drawing things from other IPs. So that can be manually moderated on the Steam Workshop, but frankly, the developer probably has better things to do. It's not, again, maybe a deal breaker, but it's something you should be aware of going into it. I want to talk about the kinds of UGC we support in ARK. Some of these are somewhat specific concepts to ARK, but I think there's some general patterns to gather from all this. We obviously support maps, just a straight-up new environment to play in. It's worth noting that you can't, with a map, change existing content. You can add new content, and you can duplicate existing content and modify that. But any new artwork, for example, has to be packed placed specifically with the new map. There's also what are called map extensions. Extensions are actually stackable. So a map from the previous slide is actually one whole new environment. But a map extension is like a piece of an environment, and you can layer them on. They could be like a floating island or an NPC or a new weather system. It doesn't even have to explicitly be something physical. And you can have as many of these loaded as you want. So we actually have an interface in the game for the end user to pick as many map extensions as they want to load up on top of a base map. Map extensions can be used on original game maps, but they can also be used on any custom map as well. Finally, there are mods themselves. Mods they're not environments, they're actually typically in ARK new items and new creatures. They can stack, meaning you can have as many mods loaded as you want because you can just add more and more and more items. There are some non-stackable capabilities that mods can use, such as changing out the core game mode. That's essentially the core game logic, your goals, any kind of application level looping logic would be in there. So a mod can swap that out as well, but if a mod does that, it's considered a non-stackable mod, and you can only have one of those kinds of mods loaded at a time. The concept of stackability is pretty important, actually, I think, for UGC. The idea that you should try to design your UGC to support as many individual pieces of content being loaded simultaneously as possible, because no one user is likely to create the perfect UGC that has everything in it anybody could ever want. Usually, a user will create a UGC that does one very specific thing. So being able to give the end user the power to combine them is part of that customization point, and I think really important to getting the full power out of the system. Finally, we have the concept of total conversions. Total conversions are a special kind of mod that lets the user change anything in the game directly. Normally with mods, you can't change existing game assets because they're already loaded. You can add stuff, but you can't really delete or modify existing stuff. But a total conversion can just go through and change anything it wants, willy-nilly, with no limitations. Very powerful. You can effectively construct an entirely new game with this approach. There was an example, of course, with sci-fi conversion. Then there's somebody who also made a pirate ship conversion. And these go deep into the systems and give a lot of power. There are some downsides, though. Because of the way the seek-free content that I mentioned earlier works, total conversions have to disable that system entirely, because we have no idea what assets the user is going to modify, and so we have to load all the assets individually and not sequentially. So it yields a slower loading time, unfortunately. I want to talk about some of the technical challenges that you'll have doing a deep UGC implementation in Unreal Engine 4 specifically, and then I'll talk about some more broad challenges that could apply to any game engine. Specifically in Unreal Engine 4, at least we had to modify the editor to support cooking user-generated content, and then run the runtime itself, the client runtime, to support loading user-generated content. And that's a little different than cooking the base game. Cooking in Unreal Engine means packing the content together in a releasable form for distribution to the end user. And UGC had to be cooked in kind of a way where it wouldn't include all the assets we had already shipped with the game in order to keep those files small. Furthermore, we had to modify the editor to be able to ship it to the end user with an integrated Steam CMD. Steam CMD is the command line application that actually allows uploading content to Steam Cloud. And we integrated it into the editor itself so the user could not really have to worry about the exact command line to pass to Steam CMD, instead could just run it through the user interface. The big thing with Unreal Engine 4, of course, you have to decide how much to write in Blueprint. That's a high-level scripting language versus C++. Needless to say, Steam Workshop is not designed to support distributing executable binary code. If you could do that, you shouldn't. It'd be a huge security risk. So essentially, the more you write in a high-level script, the more power your end users are going to have to modify that stuff in their user-generated content. The downside to high-level script, and Blueprint in particular, in the case of Unreal Engine 4, is there's a performance trade-off. So it's a difficult decision if your game is performance-intensive, like ARK, how much to write in one system or another. Do you write more in C++, better performance, or more in Blueprint, more power for modders? There's some general technical challenges to UGC as well that you'd probably face regardless of what game engine you're using. You would need to have runtime capability on the client side to download the UGC in-game asynchronously. So essentially, when the user subscribes to UGC, the game will get a callback saying a new package was subscribed to start downloading that, probably provide some user interface notification that a UGC is downloading or installing, and then you have to make it available in some user interface inside the game itself. That was necessary, but the other part of the equation is if you're doing a multiplayer online game, the server can have arbitrary UGC installed on it, arbitrary content packages, arbitrary mods. And the client may not have those installed at all when it connects the server. So we had to implement a system by which when you connect to a server, there's a handshake, and the server tells the client, I'm running these 10 individual mods, and the client has to check, do I have all these installed? If it doesn't, it has to subscribe to them, download, and install them before it actually completes the connection to the server. And that was a fair bit of work. And I think that's probably something you'd have to do in just about any online persistent game, regardless of what engine. You'd also have to support updating the UGC on the server side. If you have a dedicated server or a persistent server, eventually that server needs to update the UGC because it's going to be, a new version is going to be uploaded by the end user at some point. And there's some open questions about exactly what's the best time to do that. In our case, we just check for updates when you first start the server up. But we had to implement that into a command line server, which took a bit of work. Furthermore, there's always the possibility of a client-server mismatch. A persistent online server could be running for days, weeks, even months without being shut down. A client is probably going to be shut down and restarted every few hours. And so if the end user updates the user-generated content, and it has a newer version for the client, and an older version for the persistent server that's been running for a month, now you have a version mismatch when that client connects to the server, and maybe they can't talk to each other anymore if the changes are so significant that they would break the network communication. And there's no perfect way to handle that either. We don't want to force the server to restart necessarily. Best case scenario, you could present a message to the client saying, this particular UGC is at version 3 on the server and you have version 4. There's a mismatch, you can't connect. And then the client can tell the server admin, hey, you really should restart your server to update. It's a bit of a headache and could potentially be solved by Steam maintaining prior versions of the UGC on Steam Cloud, but that's beyond the scope, I think, of the system right now. There are the long-term maintenance problems I mentioned earlier. Future updates to the game will need to be, to some extent, regression tested against popular existing content. And it's also worth mentioning that the UGC tools themselves can be a large download. And especially if you're in early access and you're rapidly updating your game and you're adding lots of new features on a daily or weekly basis, your end users are going to pressure you to keep those tools updated as well, which could add a little bit of overhead to your development process. We'll talk about how the rollout of the UGC went on ARK and some of the techniques we used, I would say, to help ensure its success. As I mentioned, we planned UGC within a few weeks of ARK's launch, realizing that it would be helpful for maintaining kind of a robust, rapidly updated content for the game. It took us about 6 weeks or so to do the initial implementation of the system, and we ended up releasing the tools and support for it on Workshop on August 15, 2015. Pretty much the first thing we did was we launched a mod contest. It's helpful to incentivize players beyond just, hey, this is cool and you should try it. We wanted to give them a real financial incentive, you might say, to show us what they can do, make cool stuff. And I think it was very helpful because we got a lot of really good results out of that. We got hundreds of great entries, and some of them ended up frankly blowing us away, and we'll take a look at some of those in a few minutes. We also created a program, just kind of an informal program, but we let our users know about it, by which if we thought a mod or a UGC was good enough, we would contact the developer of that and ask them if we could essentially compensate them to officially incorporate their content into the game proper, and not just on Steam, but even take it to other platforms as well. And so in that way, we ended up using the UGC system as kind of what I mentioned earlier, a proving ground, a testing ground for additional content for the game. And so some of the mods that actually ended up being incorporated into the main game officially like that are, one of them was Survival of the Fittest. It is a total conversion, as I mentioned earlier. That means it can change every aspect of the game, and it really needed to, because it actually took what was a persistent online survival game and made it into a competitive battle arena Hunger Games style experience. And that began as a total conversion, and we pulled it in and actually made it ultimately a DLC for the game, or a separate app ID. Another one was a really awesome map called The Center. This is created by Ben Burkhardt, an end user. He submitted it to the mod contest, and it ended up winning. And or actually it was going to win, and then we just said, this is too freaking good. We're just going to take it in-house and cut the contest short. So it was a really great map, and we ended up actually pulling it in-house and hiring the guy to work with us on site. And it now exists on all the platforms. So in that way, the workshop item kind of was a proving ground for final content. Another mod was something called Primitive Plus. That's a total conversion that lets us change every aspect of the game, created by Cedric. I forget his last name. He's just Cedric to me. But similar situation. This was a total conversion that took out all the sci-fi and modern tech of the game and added a ton of stuff focused on primitive primal survival, all kinds of mechanics and items and weapons, just numerous levels of detail on focusing at that level of the game. And had a lot of players, had a lot of fans. We felt that it was something that we weren't really going to be focusing on ourselves, so we said, this is really good, let's take this one in-house and have it be an official part of the game. And we hired Cedric as well. So those are some examples of ones that have been gone through the official mods program, and we're looking at several more in the weeks ahead. But I wanted to give you some metrics about just how impactful UGC has been on ARK. Over 60% of players who play ARK online are playing on servers or in single player that are running UGC items, whether it's a map, a mod, or a total conversion. So a huge portion of our player base is benefiting from this, and I think may frankly not even be, they might not be playing the game if they didn't have this. Some of the most popular mods or content on the ARK workshop in terms of subscribers are the glass metal mod, which is kind of a little trite and funny, like really? Okay. It's just basically a mod that gives you a bunch of different kinds of structure options you can build. You can build a lot more metal and glass structures, but it makes sense in a game like ARK that that's something people would subscribe to. They want more variety like that. One that's not on here that's also very popular is, well, there's really a bunch of them, is architectural mods that just give you so many more items and structures to build with, way more than we could ever develop ourselves. They'd be vastly beyond the scope of the game for us to develop, thousands and thousands of little items and decorations to make your home feel your home. But for the modders, that's exactly the kind of thing they're great at. And since they all can stack, it gives the end users or the servers the capability to add as many of those items as they want. Another really popular one is called Anunnaki Genesis, and that's what's a rebalance mod. Effectively, they've taken all the content in the game and they've changed all the numbers. They've added some new mechanics as well, but it's really focused on finding what they consider to be a better balance for the game, a more serious survival-oriented balance. And we're cool with that. Like, great. We aim our balance to be a little more casual, and I think this mod is a little more hardcore. One of the most popular maps is called Valhalla, and it's like a beautiful, just scenic, picturesque, massive map that frankly has some very memorable sights and kind of raised the bar. I think it does a lot of things that even we weren't fully mastering at that time, and has a lot of subscribers, and it's probably, I would say, the most popular mod map at this point, other than the center, of course. We have plans for making UGC more powerful in ARK. We want to make the Unreal Editor more powerful for generating custom content. Specifically, we want to give players the ability to modify assets that are already in the game directly without having to duplicate them, even if they're within a mod. And we also would like to give players the ability to control, on a more basic level, exactly how you spawn in the game. Currently, the game is kind of locked into spawning you as a human, and then you can take control or ride something else. We're making some changes to let you control anything directly without having to actually have a player character in the mix. And a good test for us on that is actually a total conversion that we're working on with another team called Primal Survival. And this will be a total conversion for ARK that will let you directly play as a dinosaur and live out a dinosaur's life cycle without ever having to be a human, from the egg to the grave, I guess. And so that one should be fun. And we do that in order to improve the tools primarily. It's really a test bed for us to say how much more powerful can we make the modding. We also want to give the clients a little better visibility into the mod versioning challenge I mentioned earlier, where the server is running one version and the client's running another. Right now we kind of say there's a mismatch, but we want to actually tell them exactly what version they have and what version the other person has, to give them a little more information about what to do about it. I do have some requests for Valve if they're listening. Are they here? But basically, I think Valve could make some changes to the workshop or some feature additions that would, I think, make it even more powerful. One of them is controversial, so everybody's probably going to have their own opinion on it, and here's mine. I think they should allow premium UGC directly. I know there's a system for revenue shares, but it's still very much developer-gated, and I think taking the developer out of the equation is useful because things are usually best when they are very not centrally controlled. The capability of mod authors to actually benefit financially from their work optionally, I think would provide a lot of incentive to raise the quality of mods and actually provide a stepping stone for a lot of people who want to get into the game industry but aren't ready to have a full-time industry job yet, either because they don't want to or they're still learning. It would be a midway point between, hey, I'm just doing stuff for free, versus, hey, I've got a full-time job at an office. The midway point, effectively, could be I'm making premium content for an existing game. And I think that would be very useful for end users and the content creators themselves. More workshop storage space would be nice, as games have gotten to the AAA level and textures are now 4K and models have 100,000 triangles. Frankly, we're bursting at the seams a little bit in terms of some of these file sizes. And the limit, I think, has been increased progressively over the years on Steam Cloud for UGC. I think it could go up a little further, which would allow some of these AAA contents to become even more complex. Kind of what I was getting at earlier, the concept of branches would be useful for UGC. Obviously, as developers, we have that capability, but for UGC, the end user does not. So if they upload something, boom, it's live, the previous version is gone, destroyed, and hopefully everything's hunky-dory. Release branches would allow UGC creators to test their content a little bit more effectively, a little bit more safely, and possibly even deal with some of those challenges involving if the server has one version, the client doesn't. They could have, for example, a version which is updated very infrequently for the long-running servers, and then maybe a more volatile experimental version for their daily iteration. Steam CMD itself, as far as I know, is a standalone application, command line application, and making it a library would help the tools be a little more seamless. Right now, you can't really make the UI experience of uploading to Workshop a fully integrated UI. You essentially have to launch this command line application and get feedback from it. And if they made it a library, I think it would result in a smoother end user experience on the tool side. This is an interesting concept. Right now, when you upload a UGC, you're effectively the owner of it, and one person. And so if you're on a team of 10, ultimately that UGC is now gated by that single individual. I think they can share, say other people worked on it, but I think only one person will have the authority to continue to update it. And that can be a problem on a large team of a complex UGC if that person, the original uploader, disappears off the map or gets angry or something happens that kind of locks everybody else out of it. Now that UGC is effectively inoperable and doomed. And we've had that come up on occasion with some of the larger, more complex total conversions on ARK who they have development times of 6 months and somewhat large teams. And I think having the concept of shared ownership would better facilitate more complex team development on UGC. I'll give you the quick takeaway on what I think is important to remember about UGC at the end of the day. Having UGC will make your game stronger. You'll have a stronger community and you will have a longer lifespan on it. I do not think in almost any way UGC is a negative or even a neutral. It will always strengthen your game. The key concerns potentially are the technical challenges and the other drawbacks I mentioned. Those are questions you'll have to ask yourself. Do you want to deal with some of those technical issues depending on what game engine you're using? And do you want to potentially have less control over your product? But if the answer is you're up for it, then your game will definitely be tremendously benefited. But ultimately, the most important thing about UGC is probably why we're all here in the first place. Making games is fun, and seeing people make UGC is fun, even potentially more fun than making the game itself. It's great to be able every day to see something new in your game that wasn't there the day before and that you didn't have to make yourself. And that includes stuff like the venerable Pimp My Rex, which is also featured on the next slide here. That's pretty much it. I really would recommend everybody take a serious look at how ARK has benefited, how Dungeon Defender has benefited, and the many other games on Steam from Space Engineers onwards that have a good UGC implementation. It's worth doing. Thank you, guys.